Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Vince, and I've been doing admissions since 1989 and college counseling since 1998 in California.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Vince is back in the saddle. And in part one, Vince shares a number of admissions tips. And then we begin discussing an article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Ed by Eric Hoover entitled, College List Building is Changing. Will that make college less equitable? Our question from a listener comes from Amy from South Carolina, and she has a question about housing deposits. And our interview will be part 3 of 5 with Marissa Salizar, who's over all visits at college, and we're talking about various ways you can visit a college. And we'll resume our college spotlights in January of the new year. Friends, Vince is in the saddle today, and we're all warmed up. We had an hour catch up with each other. Half the time we were talking, I was like, I wish we were recording this. Our listeners would love this, but but good to see you again, my friend. It's been a while.
Oh, it's great to see you and hear your voice again. But, I find myself, because I usually listen to the podcasts, I take the dogs out. I try to do it twice a day. And I find myself talking during the podcast. And people look at me because I'm with my headphones on.
What are you saying, man?
I'm answering, I'm laughing.
You're not cussing us out.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, that's a great question. Oh, I can't believe that just was said out loud nationally. So I look like a mentally ill person, talking to two dogs.
I remember when you first started, you would listen on the treadmill. I remember that.
So anyway, it's great to be able to, have these conversations real time instead of while I'm walking the dog.
Yeah, Vince and I were having a good conversation earlier about a lot of things, but one of the things we were talking about is just something I'm hearing from multiple sources. There's not as much resilience in this generation, and we're trying to put our finger on it. How much of it is COVID? How much is helicopter parenting? Multiplicity of other things. But yeah, we bounce around and have some great conversations. And I may as well share with our listeners right now. So you're gonna have to wait about a half a year, but we've got a commitment from Hillary at Colorado College, Julia at Milton, and Vince, and all 4 of us are going to do a deep dive on the activities and help people with your activities. Now, we thought it'd be cruel to drop it now when people have missed the November deadlines and everything. So we'll look to air that sometime between April and June, so we can catch all of our juniors and sophomores and freshmen, and you can get some insights and that. And, it's good. Hillary's in there reading files, so she'll bring that fresh perspective. Vince, you've done it at 6 different places, man, counting the places you were a reader at.
Yeah.
You always have a lot to bring to the table, man. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the opportunity because, 25, 30% of the, yes is what are you going to bring? What are you bringing? How are you going to add? And, colleges are really savvy about that, and there's some schools out there who have billion programs, but I feel like they don't move the dial one second. You could spend a lot of money and get nothing done, or you can be thoughtful about it and not spend a lot of money and make a bigger impact.
I'm curious what you think of this. I have completely changed my view on the UC app. I used to be critical of the UC app. You know, I,
Not
I
me.
used I used to be like, there's no teacher recommendations, and 12th grade grades. They're not getting 12th grade grades, and it just felt like they were missing a lot of pieces. But I've really changed my view because the fact that you've got those four PIQs and they're a decent amount of word length, and then you've got you know 350 characters compared to 150 characters on your activities, and there's 20 of them. It feels to me like the student voice comes through a lot more with that application, with all that writing. And I've something I've always believed in, which is character should matter more in the admission process than it does. I feel like character comes out more in the UC app because there's so much more writing and many on different topics that I think it just brings that character out. Now, what are your thoughts? Because of course you've done admissions at Occidental, you've done admissions at Cal Lutheran, you've done admissions at Pomona, and you've been a reader at UCLA, Berkeley, and San Diego. So you've seen a lot of systems. What are your thoughts on sort of the UC app and what you learn about an applicant, say, compared to other apps out there?
I would say I agree with you. And I think when they launched the new version, I think it's now we're in the third, maybe the fourth year of the new application. They were so thoughtful. And I think primarily one of the reasons that the system is so accessible, besides the no longer being test blind with ACT and SAT, the fact that you have all this space to really hear the story of
Hmm.
individual applicants.
Hmm.
So you have the two additional information spaces. One is academic. There's another one at the end. The PIQs really suss out narratives that where the student can sort of tell different sides of themselves. So they're not, if there's a big obstacle they've overcome, they can still present other sides of themselves so they can balance it out if it's very significant. But then in the activities, they ask them so well. They give you so much more space. I'm waiting for the Common App the day
Hmm.
that they release the world beyond 150 characters.
Yeah, that's brutal.
But I'm a little scared too because it takes so long to get 150 characters out of kids. And so when we move to the UC application with their 20 activities, I said, nobody said write your essay, like 20 essays. They don't want that either. But you get a chance of volunteer access programs, other coursework that you took that's not A through G approved, work. You get 600 characters. So you not only find out about the organization that you're volunteering for, but you also get to hear what you did. So in terms of access, the University of California clearly was being very thoughtful about if we're going to take a chance on a student, they're going to have to demonstrate it in different ways. So we make sure that they're exhibiting qualities of grit and being able to move forward because we see it throughout this application. I'll never forget when we were getting trained, they put this app up there. I won't say what school, but they put the
Hmm.
app up there and everyone was like, because the first page with the UC app is all this information about the school, the last 3 years of kids from the school that applied, blah blah blah, and people are already at no, like you could see it on their faces. And did you start reading different parts, and people are like, this is really curious. And by the end, I think there are definitely people who were like, oh, admit, but this person also won like a scholarship, and their UCGPA was not in the bandwidth of acceptance. And it really blew people's mind. They're like, oh, but because there's so much information that you receive from that UC application, it made sense to people. Nobody said you made the worst decision, ever. But what they did say is that because they asked good questions, good information was provided, and the student was able to have the opportunity to go to that school.
Well, I was talking to a student I'm working with in the Ojai Valley area, that just outside the Santa Barbara area. And of course, we did all our Common App stuff and then we're working on UCs. And I asked her, how's, in your opinion, the UC app different than the Common App? And she was like, it's more multidimensional and brings out more facets of who I am as a person. And it makes me think more because of, before basically referring to the four, PIQs, personal interest, questions that you have to answer there. I think that's a brilliant concept. I also think their ELC, eligibility in local context, where they look at, the top 9% in your school.
Yeah.
I think that's another brilliant thing because, it just ensures that you're not just completely homogenous by social class and can get people in more under resource schools and rural schools that are crushing it there and taking advantage of every opportunity that they're given. And I don't know, I just love it. Anyway, Vince has a tip for us. Vince and I can talk. He's starting to rival Julia and Susan. And that's dangerous because you guys already know I'm a chatterbox. And you put Susan and Julia and I together, that's 2 hours for sure. Vince is starting to get to that level, so I got to be careful here. But
okay.
Vince, why don't you share the tip you have for our listeners?
All right. So the tip is sort of multi-level. I always like to hit all or many of the groups that are listening. So for the parents, we're about to go into the holidays, get that FAFSA and CSS profile wrapped up and done. So you can get merit aid awards, financial aid awards. Just make sure that you do that. For students, one thing I noticed this year, and we can talk about this, maybe now or another time, but I call it the portal check. Like, I'm shocked by what schools are putting in there. Like, one school said, they dropped one more question in there, and they're like, tell us where you've traveled, and they were like, well, and the student had gone to many places, and I said, well, how many options do you have? And he said, well, 5. Okay, so let's talk about the most recent ones. And they submitted it, and 2 days later they got it. So that
that's a sneaky trick because colleges know the harder they make the application, the less completed applications they're going to get.
Yes.
So they're all they're reluctant in most instances to make it too complex because you use a lot. How many times have we had people that say there's too many questions on that essay in that application. Like I'll pass on that one. So we know that happens because we have our students that tell us that. But so they're trying to have your cake and eat it too. Like make it more streamlined so you don't intimidate. But then when you got the deposit, and you're in, you're already in commitment wise. Like I'm applying to this school. Now we throw another one at you. Hamilton had a Y Hamilton, tucked in the portal last year, which they called optional.
It wasn't optional.
Yeah.
If you didn't answer, I remember a couple of years ago, Babson threw in this 7-day, if you want to interview, and if you hadn't opened that portal in that 7-day time, you missed it.
Yeah, it's no wonder people find this process complex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So portal check, please, people. And then thank you notes. A lot of work is going to be happening. Try to get your thank you notes in, before you're out of school.
And Vince, who do you recommend they send thank you notes to?
Teachers, the counselor, the coach, the art teacher who helped you develop your talent, your theater. Just nothing goes farther than being grateful and demonstrating that, authentically and as much as you can. So,
and I would also throw in rec writers too.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant teachers, like rec writers.
Oh, that's what you meant.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then just, things aren't going to work out. ED, restricted early action. You need to finalize your list and get the work done because there's going to be people who may have given you feedback, when it was during the fall, but during the holidays, they're not going to be available for you to get feedback from. So get that list together and get the essays done before. early decisions are already coming out. But if you want something to be reviewed, you need to do the work so that it's reviewed in a timely and efficient manner.
And this is one I like to throw in off of what you said, Vince. This is going to air on the 14th of December, and that's right around the time most of the EDs have come out by that time.
Yes.
And I'm sure this is your experience. A lot of people, I'll say, for me, the majority of people like to be pretty aspirational with their EDs.
Yes.
Like a lot of time, what I mean by that is like there's a school that they could apply to and be in, but they're kind of, hey, if I'm going to commit, I've had two different terms that families have taught me this year. I only can remember one. One family called it my shoot for the moon school. If it's an ED, I'm going to go for my shoot for the moon school. And another one had a similar term just like that. I can't remember it. And so what that means, though, is that you're probably not getting in. And I'm not talking you personally because nobody, I'm sitting here just speaking amorphously. Like I don't know who the you is. It's a collective you. Obviously, some people are getting in, but look at the stats. At the most selective schools, most people don't get an ED, even with a big ED advantage, right? And so for a lot of times, 17 and 18-year-olds, this is one of the bigger punches in the gut that they felt.
Yeah.
The pain can be magnified because other people know about it. Kids know about it. Friends know about it. Family knows about it. They're asking you what happened. And, a lot of times people can be, disconsolate. So my tip is like, it's going to work out. It really is going to work out. Like, draw on whatever you've drawn on in the past to help you weather your storms, whether you had a girlfriend dump you or, you broke a leg or had an ACL playing a sport or whatever. For some people, that's going to be something like prayer. For others, it's going to be an encouraging friend, being around positive people, or whatever you like to do. Journal, walk, jog, however, get out and see nature, or whatever you do to sort of find some comfort and solace. But it really is going to work out. Like, Rick Clark likes to tell the story of most of the top tour guides at Georgia Tech will tell you that Georgia Tech was not their top choice. And they couldn't be happier that they ended up at Tech.
Yeah.
Maybe they took a shot at a Stanford or an MIT.
Yeah.
And it didn't work for them. And they're at Tech and they're happy as a lark. And they said, let me be a tour guide because I love this place. So I know you're in the moment now and it stings and that pain is real, but there really is light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm only sharing that because of the timing of when this is going to go live. It really is the time when people are going to be getting their decisions back, and the majority are not going to get good news, given the fact that most people tend to go for a real aspirational school with lower admit rates.
Yeah.
All right. Good stuff. So our admissions vernacular is the term institutional methodology, and it's a big term with a lot of syllables. It's used primarily when it comes to financial aid, and it has to do with what is the process that is used to determine what your aid award will be. There's the federal methodology, which is clearly prescribed, and that's the Department of Education generates that, and that's what you would get in a FAFSA. But when it comes to schools that use the CSS profile, they use a different methodology, what they refer to as the institutional methodology. I like to explain it like a smorgasbord. There's literally like 300 levers they can pull and choose to pull and apply in different ways. And so when you hear that term used, institutional methodology, it's normally used to how a school comes to the determination of how much you can afford if you are applying for financial aid. And they have their own process. Now, it's not without its guidelines. There's certainly things, for example, a school can't go off the reservation and say, we're going to start using your 401k and factor that into your student aid index. Like, no, it's been prescribed that retirement plans, don't count in the way money's calculated. if they're looking at assets and how much of your assets go to your student aid index, there's some clearly prescribed guidelines there. But there's a million other things that schools can do to alter their own individual approach to how they assess your aid award. Vince, it's been almost maybe more than 5 years now. I had David Jelinas on. That point, he was in year 42, director of financial aid at Davidson, and we answered the question. Yeah, the question that might have been back before you were listening. It was it was one of the first interviews. But the question I wanted him to answer for us was, why is it that when a student gets in 6 schools, they get 6 completely different offers? What are all the reasons why? And we went over all of the reasons why, or at least the main reasons. That's because of institutional methodology. I do think we need to come back to that and do a part 2 on that. It's been almost 6 years.
Yeah,
do a
that
deeper dive,
would be good, because that has evolved, like this whole process.
Yeah. No, and especially in terms of, even something as little as home equity, right? Like how schools assess home equity is all over the place.
It is.
All over the place, especially for the institutional methodology. But as real estate started going through the moon in California, and you had a lot of families that had modest incomes, but if you're going to take a big chunk of my home equity, it makes it look like I can't, it makes it look like I can pay $60,000 to go to college when I'm making $120,000, two people each making 60 grand. How could I pay that?
Right.
And so what you saw in response to that, Stanford, USC, to name a couple schools that said, we won't count home equity. It's an example of how, kind of how this stuff can evolve. But it takes some deep pockets to do that. You're leaving, anyway, enough on money. Enough on money. Our big number is 83. While it seems like people are all applying to 15 schools, 18 schools, 13 schools, 20 plus schools, Common App recently released their updated average applications per student, and they are substantially up. They're up about 50% in the last 10 to 15, I can't remember if it's 10 years or 15 years, in terms of the number of applications that each average student applies to. But still, 83% of students apply to 10 or less. So while it might think, you might think, gee, everyone's applying to 15 schools. That's a certain subset of the population. Still have 83%. It's a pretty big number that apply to 10 or less. So just the big number for the day, 83. All right, Vince, why don't you introduce our article? And, once you did that stupendous description, I recruited you as as the guy who does the recap when your month's up. So I'll let you give a recap of the article as well.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
All right. So today's article, the student list, business is changing. Will that make student recruitment less equitable? It was written by Eric Hoover, and he proposed that because of the surge in test optional policies regarding college admission, more people, especially those who are low income and minority students, as they opt out of testing, colleges may not be able to find them. And the rationale behind that, and this comes from a study that was released recently by the Institute of College Access and Success, an educational advocacy group known as TICAS, which basically says the process of recruiting and identifying students through these lists that are generated when everyone or a majority of students who were in high schools were taking the PSAT or the PACT, it allowed the list generation that colleges could have access to. If you're not doing those tests, if you're opting out of those tests, then there's a whole segment of students that are not accessible to colleges, so they can't buy those names. So basically, just to give you a little bit of a landscape, the lists that are generated cover, a college can purchase the list, the students' contact information. Colleges can identify students by test score range, high school GPA, zip codes. Colleges can use the information to recruit and begin to contact. You see students being recruited as early as freshman or sophomore year, depending on when the school that they go to offers the test. And they start getting brochures and email messages, and it's kind of the lifeblood. But in this report, they identified that with COVID, with the advent of COVID, there were less lists available. Students were not getting contacted. And ultimately, without student search being available to colleges, there's this big gap. So as schools become test blind, test optional, their email, their ability to contact students that might serve to recruit more diverse, economically, socially disadvantaged students, if they're not getting the information. And they did a study. They found that students who were getting regular emails from many colleges, they were 22% more likely to apply. And anything that gets students who are vulnerable, who are not often in the subgroup of students who are generally applying to college, anything that it can encourage them to get involved in the process of applying to college, which means looking at your curriculum, building up your extracurricular activities, building the rapport and support from your high school to help you apply. If that goes away, then there's a whole segment of the U.S. Society that's not getting access to something that really is a driver of economic success in our country. So they propose that there needs to be alternatives for students to be able to put their information out there so colleges can recruit them. And they said that one of the organizations that is doing that is called EAB. It's a large enrollment consulting company. Students can go in and they can add their information through College Board, and colleges can then go in and pay for a service to get access to that information. This particular report found that it was problematic for this to be the replacement for not having access to PSAT and PAC scores or AP scores, because students, they don't even know this thing exists. And then if you go to College Board, where would you find that? And why would anyone do that? And if they're already there, they're probably already taking the PSAT, because that's the first introduction to the College Board website. They also felt that there was also some access issues in terms of, if students are getting on the list, they tend to be from higher socioeconomic groups. They're getting bombarded in multiple ways because colleges are only seeing certain types of students. And their recommendation is a free system where you would need the states, districts, schools all sort of working together nationally to propose this, so public access, gathering resource where all that information that typically College Board and ACT would gather would be in one system, and then colleges could have access to that. The issue there is, who's going to pay for that? Who's gonna use that? But what's interesting is they purport it was kind of an unknown benefit that for years, by having people have access to testing, to the PSAT and PAC, they were in fact helping grow the number of students who were aware with college. So this was a great article to raise awareness for people and for colleges. It's a great national issue because, again, you want students in the United States to continue to be educated, because that drives economic success and helps the population and the country move forward. So that's kind of my summary.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the name of the article is called "The College List Business is Changing. Will That Make Student Recruitment Less Equitable?" Now, we've done at least 3 other episodes on student search. I know episode 28 was literally called "Why Am I Getting All This Mail?" And that was, and then I remember another one. I can't remember the episode number. Maybe I'll look it up and insert it in here. But that one really did a deeper dive and went into like all the different ways in which schools can target the students that they want to start mailing and email campaigns to. But and then maybe a year and a half ago, we had an article that was a debate between Rick Clark and Brennan Barnard, who take different positions. Rick's more pro-search and Brennan's not as pro-search. So that was an interesting one. But just in case you're new or you don't know what we're talking about, I'm going to just go back to the start here. So the way I like to explain this, Vince, to students that I work with is I like to start with a question. I like to ask them, what are the ways in which colleges can find out that students are even out there? Like, what are the ways to even get them into what we refer to as the admissions funnel? You start out with your list of prospects. And so I start going through the ways with them, right? So one way is to visit schools, but you can't possibly visit every school in America. I quote 43,000 high schools because I'm going with Jeff Salingo's number. I've seen some other people say 33,800, 34,000. I haven't counted them. So whether it's 34,000, 43,000, it's a lot of high schools. There's no way you could visit every high school. And if you did, every kid you'd want to reach wouldn't show up anyway. They'd have a chemistry test or something. You could come into the area and start doing fairs. But do you think every kid that you want in your funnel is going to show up at a fair, let alone show up at your table?
Right.
You can do everything in your power to try to get them to visit your school, or even go check out your You Visit video and visit you virtually. But fool's errand to think you're going to reach the masses doing that. You can do receptions in places like Marriott's. You're going to reach some, but you're not going to reach the masses. You can build networks with school counselors and independent educational college coaches. Once again, you're just going to get a sliver. And guess what? All those things I said are things colleges do. They do all of those things. That's what you do when you're recruiting. But every one of them is just reaching just a minute portion of the population. Student search was the one thing that really gave you access to pretty much everybody college bound. However, it worked so much better in an era when almost everybody was submitting the test score. Friends, this concludes the first part of Vince and I talking about the Chronicle article that takes a look at student search. We'll come back next week with another half an hour for the final part. Hope you'll join us.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Amy from South Carolina with your question about housing deposits.
Hi, YCBK team. This is Amy from South Carolina. My question is about housing deposits. I'm the mom of a senior who's received several acceptances to large public flagship institutions, and cross our fingers, hope we will get a few more in the coming months. I understand housing can be tight at many of these institutions. While we want to have great housing, we also want to have plenty of time to make a decision. What's your advice about timing for housing deposits? Thanks for all that you do. I really appreciate all of you and your team's work.
So, Julia, you've heard the question. What are your thoughts?
I'm actually super curious your thoughts, Mark. And thank you, Amy, for asking this question, because quite literally, I just got an email from my advisee's mom being like, is this something you can help us with? Can you help us advise what to do with housing deposits? It is becoming more and more of a thing. A lot of my students do do not traditionally apply to super large state schools. So it's becoming more something that I've been thinking about. And oftentimes I'll say this too, most of the students that are in this spot, it feels so unfair. And I have a hard time navigating it because oftentimes they might be sort of middle need folks where it's not super comfortable to put down a deposit you might not get back. And you want to be sure that you're not boxed out of an affordable option or the best option as time goes on. It's the same thing I hate about like tiered housing, right? That if you want to pay more money, but at least with tiered housing, there's theoretically enough available. So I guess for a lot of these schools too, if you're applying to larger schools or public schools that are large and they require a housing deposit at a certain time, you might also have others in your list, just like Amy's child does, that you don't know the results yet. And you would rather go to that school, but you're having to make a decision about a deposit. In this case, and I'd be curious what you say, Mark, I have my students identify one of the ones they've already gotten. And also, this is a privilege of my experience, is that I can maybe predict what's going to happen at the other schools. And so I could probably be a little more forceful if I think maybe the students' options currently are some of the best they'll get, and maybe encourage them to do a housing deposit to make sure that they get housing and the best housing, especially if they are not in the area. They don't know the area. The area might be expensive. And especially as a first-year student, I really feel strongly if you're not from that area, that living on campus is so much more helpful to you in your transition to college. So maybe we identify one or two. I would hope just one that you do put on a housing deposit, knowing you're going to lose that deposit potentially. But I wonder for students who don't maybe have a counselor that can maybe guess how things are going to go later on. So that way, maybe you could save some money. I'm curious how students navigate that, but I guess I would say maybe one or two deposits at places you've heard from already that you really see yourself potentially attending if the other schools, or at least many of the other schools you might have might not work out, or if maybe you got admitted to a school that is less selective, less auspicious for you, and you've got some less selective options still coming back, maybe you can bank on the fact that you might get into those given that you've gotten into an already more selective school. But it's a hard game to play, and I hate that people have to lose money, but I do think housing your first year is really it's limited, and it's really helpful for your transition. So I would sometimes encourage students to deposit even when we might have a better option later.
So I encountered this question a lot, and it definitely encountered it a lot in CBO work at KIP as well. It's going to be completely case by case in this situation. It really is. Part of it is going to depend on the resources of the family, because for some people, the housing deposit is such an insignificant amount that it's just a complete no-brainer for them. Right. A lot of the housing deposits are like $200, $150, $250. And where people live is really important to them, like you said.
Yeah.
So my experience is most people just go ahead and pay it because they really do. They value this housing over that housing more than the couple $100.
Right.
The other thing is, there are a decent, sizable number of schools that actually will refund your housing deposit to you if you let them know by May 1st. Mm-hmm. There's not a small number of schools that do that. So in some cases, it's almost like what we used to do in sales, which is just like, there's a psychology of like furthering people along the commitment line.
Right.
Where it's like moving them down the admissions funnel more. Like when they put a deposit, there's a certain amount of investment that goes into that, or even getting a read on whether the percentage of people that don't put down deposits is sometimes an indication of yield of what you can get there. So it's a little bit of a yield test. Like some schools use interviews for things like that. Right. Mm-hmm. So, my experience with most people is, if the kid really didn't want to go to the school, mm-hmm. the kid won't really be pushing for it that much anyway. Mm-hmm. But if it is one of the one or two or three that they're seriously consider, they usually really want the parents to do that. And parents usually find a way of making that happen, even if it means we'll sacrifice in another area.
Mhm.
Now, where it gets more problematic is when they start getting higher up into higher dollars.
Right.
And then, like we said, $250 could be a really lot for one family if you're going to lose it. So $250 to one family is like $25,000 to somebody else and $2,500 to somebody else. So it's hard to say, oh, that's not a lot of money, because it's all completely relevant. Even when I was working at KIPP, which had a high percentage of students that would be Pell eligible, most of the people were putting housing deposits down to get the dorm that they wanted, you know? And so that just was very important to them, because you know how it is. There's apartment style and there's suite style and there's these kinds of bathrooms and there's like part of me hates the facilities wars that we've had with colleges over the years.
Yeah.
But I also understand it when I see how strongly people feel about things like housing. Like, people can feel very strongly about housing. It can be a really big factor for them in terms of how much they like a school or don't like a school. And so I do understand schools saying, it's a lot of money, but we're going to have to upgrade these corridor traditional style dorms, and we're going to have to come up with some suite style, apartment style, Jack and Jill, and make the dorms a little nicer because we're losing kids over it. Like, that might seem superficial, but it's not. Like, people's space where they live is important to them.
Totally.
You know, and a lot of people, if they have their own bedroom at home and it's pretty nice and they're already, like, to them, the compromise is already a roommate. And now you're giving me a roommate and a shoebox and whatever, community bathroom, you know? So I'm not saying to just go ahead and do it, because everything has to fit within your budget, has to fit within your priorities. I'm just more reporting to you what students do that I work with. They do, if it's one of their 2 or 3 favorites, they do it most of the time. And don't assume that you can't get a refund, because not some schools advertise that a lot. Like, you can get a refund if you don't, and some don't. They kind of like the idea of, you know, you getting the commitment out there. But if you really ask, you can find out. But I will say this, for those that do a refund, May 1st is usually a pretty hard date for that. Like, you will lose your refund. It's not like a forever refund.
Right.
Like, like there's usually a firm date that you need to notify them by, and there's the policies and procedures. They want it, whatever, it's portal upload, email. I mean, you know, you have to read the procedures for notification. That can vary from school to school as well. So that's my advice. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yes.
And Amy from South Carolina, you know what? This is one of the first questions we've had from South Carolina. That excites me when we get a state. Yeah. Make sure you reach out to me and let me know which of the books that you want that we have. I think our listeners know the books that we have right now. We have Elliot Felix's book, which has to do with 127 things to do once you're at college to be successful in college. And then we have Dr. Lewis Newman's book, which is about the importance of thinking critically and developing your critical thinking skills in college. So just shoot me a text at 404-664-4340. Say, hey, I'm Amy from South Carolina. I was on episode number, this question, and we'll get you that book out. All right. Thanks, Amy.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, hopefully you're enjoying my interview with Marissa Salizar as we do a real deep dive on the various ways that you can visit a college. In part 1 and part 2 of my interview with Marissa, we looked at open houses and admitted student visit programs. But in part 3, which is our longest segment, we focus on 2 very different types of visits, the fly-in program and the typical traditional daily visit. So Marissa describes what is required for the application for a fly-in program and what does the selection process look like. Marissa talks about what actually happens on a fly-in when a student gets to Colorado College. Marissa talks about whether students lie on their self-reported transcripts. Marissa talks about whether socioeconomics plays a role in who gets a fly-in invitation. Marissa talks about how the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action impacts fly-in programs. Marissa gives an overview of landscape. We then transition to the daily visits, and Marissa gives us advice on how to set up a daily visit, as well as what students can expect on a daily visit. Marissa gives advice to parents on what to do and what not to do on the daily visit. Marissa answers frequently asked question. If a student wants to meet a faculty member on a visit, how do they set this up? Marissa answers the question, who else can a student request to meet on their daily college visit? And finally, Marissa answers the question, how long should a family allocate when visiting a college for a daily college visit? Listen and enjoy. So you mentioned fly-ins. Let's talk a little bit about fly-ins. I know different schools do fly-ins differently. Talk to us a little bit about your fly-in program and who you're targeting there and what the process looks like.
Yeah, so we have Experience Colorado College, which happens in the fall, and then Discover Colorado College in the spring for our admitted students. I think in light of the SCOTUS ruling, it looks a little bit different this year for us and how we're recruiting our students. And so primarily when we're on the road and we're recruiting, we're trying to target and market to underrepresented students, first generation, low income, right? And I think during the application process, it's looked a little different for us over the years. So I think right now our model is, self-reported transcript, we're test optional, and then there's I think a 200 or 300 word supplement where they essentially will write, why are you interested in checking out a place like CC? We've done away with counselor letters of recommendation. So we're trying to simplify the process to, break down those barriers. And they'll come on campus for, usually it's about 2 days. With fly-in, travel to and from, it could be 3 days. But they do have specialized programming, like I mentioned, the affinity conversations where they get to chat with students of color, low income, first gen, right? On
Sure.
campus, they do a community breakfast with alum, faculty of color, and they also do some exploring of the springs, right? Which I feel like you don't always get that in programming of like focusing so much on the school that you forget that you're also part of a bigger community in the city that you're in. And so we take them on a tour of the downtown area. We take them to Garden of the Gods, which is a landmark in our city. So you kind of get to know both the campus community and the city as well.
So obviously fly-ins are really expensive, not only, and they're a lot of work, there are a lot of just cost even on the ticket, but then when you think of the labor of all the man hours of people getting salaries and benefits, it's a lot. So how are you pre-screening so you can sort of feel like, okay, we can justify the ROI here. We're not bringing in a bunch of people that we weren't going to admit. Like, have you found the self-reported transcript, people exercise integrity and that works for on that piece of things?
Yes, I want to say this started about 3 years ago, the self-reported transcript, and we have felt that students, are very truthful when it comes to that. We haven't run into any issues with students being dishonest. But I think when it comes to the selection process, because you are right, it's an all hands on deck type of situation. We do our best to overlap it with fall open house though, so that since faculty and staff are already going to be a part of this fall open house, we might as well just have them all in one. But the selection piece, usually we find students that have done their research, right? There's some specifics there. They have a firm understanding of the block plan system. There are some ways to be able to see if a student is genuinely interested.
Friends, I'm doing something I've never done, and we're about to go into year 7 of the podcast. I'm stopping this interview because I don't want you to miss something that Marissa says right after this recording is over. This is a unique opportunity that could apply to your student at a college fair, or maybe there's an information session at a place like a Marriott, or maybe it's a school visit and your student attends. Now, this is a unique opportunity, I must say, that applies almost exclusively to a certain kind of school, and Colorado College is one of these schools. What I'm referring to are smaller schools that are mostly residential, that do holistic admissions, that meet full demonstrated need. That would be the category of school that what Marissa is about to say applies to. I thought by stopping before she says it, it'll draw your attention to it and you won't miss it if you're driving or jogging or whatever you do when you listen to the podcast. All right, back to Marissa.
I know for me, particularly being in the South, a lot of students I've met at high school visits or I've met at college fairs, and that's a good indicator for me to be like, okay, I remember this student, I think they'd be a good fit overall. So there's a couple ways that we're able to parse out and get down to the 80 students, right, that we'll end up selecting in the end. And in the spring, this year is our first year we're having 2 fly-in programs. It'll happen over both admitted student weekends. And we're hoping to have about 60 to 80 per event.
So besides the transcript, what are the ways? What are the ways that you're trying to discern? Yeah, I think this is somebody that, obviously when you're doing a fly-in, your assumption is that this is going to be a competitive candidate. You don't want to be flying people in that you think are not admissible, right? You're not only competitive from a standpoint of academically admissible, but somebody who would be a nice addition to the community based on everything that you know. So are you kind of relying on who admissions people meet on the road, and everyone's sort of given the prerogative, like, we trust you, and if you meet someone and have a conversation, then we'll defer to you? Or because I think you said you've done away with the counselor piece, so you've done away with that. So how are you vetting people besides just the transcript to get people that look like they would be worth that investment?
Oftentimes, you're right about the community aspect of it, right? Like if the academics are clearly there, then we look to what are they doing in their community? Are they making an impact? Are they intellectually curious, right? Are they elevating classroom conversation? Are they leaders in their community? So that's one indicator. I mentioned the supplemental question. We rely pretty heavily on what students are saying in that supplement. Sure. It may be even less about, writing specifics about CC, but how they envision being part of our community and what they've done in their high school time and career to be able to add to our community. So I think those are 2 key pieces that we rely on, not just in the fly-in program, but through our general reading process as well. Is yes, most students that are applying to CC are academically qualified, like checkbox there. It's really about who you're going to be and how you're going to show up once you're on our campus. That tends to be the selling piece or the kind of end all be all in our process.
I'm really happy to hear you say that, because we're always trying to emphasize how important the custom college specific questions are that colleges ask in the evaluation. And it's nice to hear you say we rely on that pretty heavily to try to discern fit and match.
I also want to state one little thing I want to add there. While there is no official teacher recommendation that has to be submitted, counselors do have a section on the application where they can write a sentence or 2 in support of the student. But we have found that traditionally with the caseloads that counselors have, especially coming from larger public schools, it's just not an option. And we don't want to, what's the word I'm looking for? Reprimand the student for not being able to get that letter of rec. So I just wanted to sort of emphasize and explain why we don't have that, but there is still room for counselors to advocate. So that can definitely be a piece of the pie if it's in there.
So what about on the socioeconomics piece? So I'll give you an example, Emory in Atlanta, there was a time when they would have sort of financial parameters, not necessarily for the fly-in, but whether they would cover your airline ticket. They would still give you the invite, but if you're at certain income limits, then you kind of could, if you got here on your own, then you're welcome to sort of participate. But then they found that was kind of almost more of a hassle, because they had to coordinate all these different times and the logistics of everything. Yeah. You know what I mean? You can sort of see what that could lead to, right?
I know where you're going.
Yeah. So they went away from a socioeconomic component to it. Then, compare and contrast that with, UPenn. I haven't seen recently, but I know a couple years ago, they sort of had a $65,000 family income will cover you. And they were targeting, under-resourced families. And those were the ones that were getting the fly-in. And so how have you factored socioeconomics at all into who gets a fly-in?
I'm almost kind of scarred to talk about this, because we did that in the spring of this year, where we had almost a tiered system. And it was this socioeconomic status, you're eligible for your full flight plus $100 towards your guest flight. And then tier 2 is, you get the hotel, but not this. And It was a logistical nightmare, if I'm being honest. It was, like you had mentioned, a lot to manage.
Sure.
And things were often lost in translation of who's qualified for what. And, you know, if students find out that they're in this tiered system, like what does that look like? And, how do we convey like what each tier means? So this year, we're doing away with the tiered system. And historically, what we have done, because for the fall, we don't have that income information a part of the application to know. So it really comes down to the spring semester of students that are Pell eligible. Those students are the ones that we're primarily offering this fly-in program to. And so I think, and again, I'm not on the outreach and access team anymore, so I'm not sure that they're 100% going this direction, but I think we're going to be moving back to that older model versus trying to even out different socioeconomic disparities. It was a lot with the tiered system.
No, I can imagine it. I find it fascinating to see the different ways schools handle this. Like, I had Sue Gordon from Willamette on, who's been the dean there for director of admission for a long time, and they give a $400 credit to any family to visit if they haven't visited yet. Okay. And then when I visited UPS Puget Sound, they will take $1,000 off the cost of the first year if somebody comes. So they're only really having to spend the money if somebody makes the enrollment, but they still can use it as an incentive.
Right.
And so like there's just so many different models out there, whether you're targeting a certain income, whether there's an incentive, whether you want everybody to participate because just getting them on campus is just going to really correlate well with yield. And I don't know. It's just fascinating for me to see all the different permutations out there of this kind of thing.
And it makes you wonder if the SCOTUS ruling will have folks, especially deans and directors, re-envisioning how they have historically done the fly-in program and if that will affect how they proceed moving forward. Because I could see offering that $1,000 once they are admitted, that might not be as useful as offering that on the front end.
Yeah.
To make sure that you're still enrolling a diverse and talented class.
So we should talk about that. And for listeners who may not be that familiar with the fly-ins, traditionally, one of the main things fly-ins did target was underrepresented students of color. That's been one of the main things, not exclusively. WPI targeted women to try to get to 50-50 in their engineering program. So, there's programs targeting women. There's programs targeting first gen and Pell and making them socioeconomic and being race blind. But traditionally, one of the biggest groups for the fly-in it's been a multicultural diversity recruitment tool, right? And so what changes are you hearing or seeing or observing anything as you interact with different people? Like you said, you guys have changed it. I noticed the number of schools that did fly-ins was reduced significantly this year, but some still felt they still felt that what the Supreme Court said wasn't targeted toward recruitment, and they were, fell within the confines of what they were able to do legally. What are you hearing either from other schools or sort of general counsel on the legal stuff?
Well, when it came to the fly-in program, when we rolled it out, the ruling hadn't been released yet. And so for us, that was part of the application process, but then we redacted that once the ruling came out, just because we don't want to get sued, right?
Sure.
And so
that's also changing people. Yeah.
Yes. We're all coming in just more conservative when it comes to, admission around race. And so that was definitely a decision we made hard and fast, whether legal counsel had advised that or not. And so after the application had closed is when our dean, director, and VP went into legal counsel and said, okay, now that this has passed and, that's done, let's focus on the spring. And what does that mean for our flying in the spring? And I think what it's coming down to is, we're going to need to come into this race blind world and find new ways to still recruit talented and a diverse class within the confines of our new legal system.
Do you think it's almost inevitable that there's going to be more targeting around socioeconomics with that, or maybe even hardship, that's not linked necessarily to race?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we've even seen in our reading process links to socioeconomic status, but also I'm not sure if you're familiar with the College Board's landscape
Yeah.
tool that they have integrated. That can also be an indicator as well, depending on what the scores are. So, yeah, there are a couple ways that we're able to still recruit those students. I will also say that a lot of us that have supplemental questions, we are also asking about lived experience and how has that shaped the student, and in some ways they are able to address those life situations. And so there are a couple ways that colleges we've seen over the past couple of months be able to still recruit a diverse class.
Why don't you tell our listeners, many will be familiar, we've done an episode on landscape, but that was a few years ago. I remember, what was it called before? Remember how they changed the name initially? It was what was the original term for it? And they had to change the name, adversity score or something. Anyway, I should remember. We did a whole big blurb on it, but then they had to do a reboot. And we've done segments on that, but it was probably like 2019. So not everybody may be familiar with landscape. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit what landscape is and how it impacts recruitment, or how it factors into either file reading or recruitment?
Yeah. So landscape was rolled out by College Board, and it essentially has students on a 0 to 100 scale, 0 being like a very privileged community, 100 being the most adverse communities, under-resourced, right? Things like that. And so there's two indexes. There's what the student index is, and then there's the college index. You're kind of able to see from two different landscapes or perspectives. And so it has a couple different segments. There's like housing, there's career opportunities, there's one about income. And so it gives those different disparities in the community so that you can see if a student is coming from an under-resourced background. They also have ACT and SAT averages for that high school context as well. Because what we have found, especially in admission process, is a student could have, let's say, a 24 ACT, which is not within our middle 50%, it's actually below, but for them, they're in their 75th percentile at their school, right? And that's a really great score for them. And so when they were submitting that score to us, right, there was that disparity of like, it's a really great score in their high school context, but maybe not for the college as a whole. And so understanding that difference was really key in our process of being able to still advocate for that student, even though in our process that score hurts overall. That's just one example. And again, we're test optional now, so it's a little bit different. But it helps to frame the conversation of where a student is growing up from, what their lived experience is like in that community. So there's a couple different ways for us to navigate those conversations, but they're especially important when it comes to our team-based reading and our committee conversations.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, if you've heard our podcast at all, you know that I may not watch a lot of movies, but I watch a lot of YouTube, which I've dubbed YouTube University. And our recommended resource this week comes from YouTube. You may also know that my favorite economist is Roz Chetty. And Roz Chetty is the Director of Opportunity Insights. This is a nonpartisan research and policy institute based at Harvard, focused on improving economic inequality or equality. And a recommended resource is a conversation he had on social mobility in America with the Washington Post. So you can easily find it. You just have to go to YouTube and put in Roz Chetty on social mobility in America. Or just, if you put in Roz Chetty, it'll pull up right away. And that's spelt Rajchetty. Now, we spoke about this about 6 months ago a few times on this podcast, because this is based on new groundbreaking research that shows how being rich in and of itself is its own qualification when it comes to the college admission process. But I wanted to include this here because you've heard me say I like it sometimes when our co-hosts get into debates, because I think as a listener, it helps you to process different arguments and helps you develop your own thinking. Well, I've been pretty vociferous in my support for Frank Bruni's book, where you'll go is not who you'll be. And he makes a compelling case that it's your character more than your degree that determines your destiny when it comes to your career. And I believe that. But there is another argument, and I think it's important that you hear that as well. And Ross Chetty makes a compelling case in this 45-minute YouTube video that students that graduate from the Ivy Plus schools have inherited career advantages and outcomes that are disparate, that create an own social class for them. And we've talked before about the Ivy Plus group being the 4 Ivy League schools, and then Stanford, MIT, Duke, and the University of Chicago. You've heard me say before, why that group? Why not Caltech? Why not Northwestern? Why not Rice? But it is what it is. They've settled on these 12 schools as what they call Ivy Plus. And he makes a compelling case that graduates from these schools just have career outcomes that are indisputable. Now, others have argued that when you take people that have got into these schools and have gone elsewhere, their career incomes have been equally as impressive. Because there's always a question, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Is it the fact that the person got into the school, or is it the fact that they have the drive, the motivation, the networking skills, the intelligence that they're going to do well regardless of where they go? Doesn't really look at that, but he just looks at some new compelling research. I think it's a fascinating, interesting video. We'll link it in the show notes, and I strongly encourage you to check it out. I'll now return to my interview with Marissa Salizar. So let's talk daily visits, because that's what most people do when they visit a college. And so what's your advice for a student and a parent that's going to do a daily visit? Like, start right from the start on maybe signing up on the web, or, do you recommend they just go with whatever the program is? Do you recommend that they try to reach out, and if they have a special request, they add the special request? I mean, talk to us a little about daily visits.
Yeah, so definitely recommend going to the website first. You'd be surprised by how many folks give us a call and we just end up directing them back to the website anyway. So save us all a phone call and just look it up on the website, right? So all of our availability is listed on there. And I would say once you've gone through that first step, it gives you a schedule for the day, and ours is pretty minimal. It's just an information session and a campus tour. Some campuses, like I mentioned, you can have lunch with the student, you can get a specialized tour, you can go see housing. So it quite depends on which campus you're visiting. For me, though, I always tell students, where are we on your list, right? If we are, let's say, number 15 out of 20, probably just going into an information session and campus tour is a thumbs up, right? You're on the right track. If we're number 1 or 2, though, maybe you're going to want to set up a one-on-one meeting with your admission rep. Maybe you're going to want to go to the film department to chat with a faculty or admin to chat more about the course curriculum that they offer, or go see a housing dorm room. So I think really it depends on the college list. That's always where I tell a student to start. It's really going to dictate how you should shape your day. Does that make sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense, because the reality is you're dealing with a finite amount of time, and like I'm a fan of the more longer, fuller visit, but it doesn't always work logistically when people say, listen, I only have a certain amount of time when I can miss school. And obviously I don't want to come when the place is closed, and it has to work logistically for my parents. And I'm particularly talking about someone like visiting outside of like a 90-minute radius of their house,
Yep.
But it could even pertain to that, to be honest, because missing school, like 90 minutes drive one way plus a couple hours, 90 back, that's still a full day, right? So,
absolutely.
So I realize, like, the fuller visit that I like people to do doesn't always work. So it really does make sense to say, do the more comprehensive visit for sort of your higher priority schools.
I will also say, I believe in the divide and conquer. If you as a student and your parent are coming with you, maybe your parent goes to the information session while the student is going to the film department. Maybe students going on campus tour and mom or dad are going to see a housing, building on campus. So, because I totally agree, Mark, like folks only have a certain amount of time on campus. Maybe there's a flight they have to catch. There's
Sure.
practice they have to get to after school. So I'm totally down for the divide and conquer. And I tell families that even at open houses as well, of like, make sure you're spending your time wisely. You don't all need to see the same thing at the same exact time. You can get way more out of your visit if you're each going to see individual things. You come back together and discuss.
Do you have any tips for students or parents on daily visits? Either like do this or don't do this. Anything that you can think of that would either be exemplary behavior or bad behavior?
For parents?
Yeah, that's who our audience is.
I don't want to get hate mail.
No, they'll appreciate the tip. So you're preventing them from stepping into a landmine.
No, I want to start with, we love parents, right? Like they bring such an awesome dynamic to campus, and I think ask a lot of the critical questions that students may be scared to ask or don't know to ask. And so I want to start with like, we love when you come to campus. And so if you can make that time, I highly recommend it. I think the bad behavior tends to come into the picture where the student feels overshadowed by the parent, and they're what's that term? The helicopter parent, where they're asking all the questions, they're talking over their student. I see that time and time again, and I think that hurts the student's experience overall. And so I think let's shy away from that. Maybe you get together as a family before the visit and you come up with a list of questions so that the student feels prepared to come into the campus visit with critical questions to ask. And it feels less of like you're trying to overpower them. Because ultimately this is the student's decision, and then we want them to feel empowered to ask those questions. We actually on campus tours will separate parents and guests from students. So there is always that built-in space for students to speak candidly and ask those critical questions. But I would say that's my biggest piece of advice to the parents that are listening, is really to just kind of take a step back and let your student explore campus and get to know the campus culture, right? Like it's their decision overall. So I hope they don't hate me for that.
No, it's good. It's all good. No, that's really good stuff. Thanks, Marissa. So here's a question I get a lot. So let's say there's a faculty member that I'm really interested in meeting. Like I've done some research, I've looked at the department, I've read it, and I've seen, wow, this person teaches this super exciting thing. Do you recommend the person tries to contact the faculty member directly and see if it's possible to meet them on the visit, or do you recommend they try to go through the admission office?
Selfishly, less work for me if they just reach out to the faculty.
Right.
We at CC, and I think most colleges have departmental admin assistants. So I always recommend students reach out to the admin member of that department, because even if that faculty member is not available, maybe there's another one that is, that can speak more holistically, maybe not specifically to that class or research, but they will still have knowledge. So I always recommend to reach out to just the department as a whole to see if you can't set something up. Because in the end, I'm doing what you're doing. I'm just sending an email to, Joe over in economics, which you can just kind of take me out as the middle person and just go directly to themselves. So that's what I usually recommend.
What are the things that are legitimate requests for, let's say this is somebody that's in your tier 1 that says, whatever school, we'll broaden this. Obviously we're talking about CC, but we're giving advice for all visits to everybody here, right? So we'll go with your thing. We're going to do the more fuller visit on more your top tier. What are some of the things that you feel are legitimate requests for a student that are not over the top? So we've already said one could be meeting a faculty member, right? I think you mentioned earlier, I have a bunch I want to ask you about, but why don't I just ask it to you open-endedly, and then I'll ask you about some that you probably don't mention, in your answer, and tell me if you think it's legit or not.
I think athletics. Coaches are always excited to chat with prospective students that haven't been on their radar. So that's one that we traditionally get requests for. So we'll set up that partnership for them. Housing is one that we get a lot. And unfortunately, we just do not have the support staff to offer that every single day. Students are, of course, welcome to go tour the building with an admission officer at hand to open up the buildings. but they can't get a full 360 view of a room, unfortunately. So that's a little less likely to happen. On tour, we already go and see like public spaces like the library. Students will see one of the academic buildings on campus. And so those are already built into our structure. The dining hall is another one we get asked a lot about. We used to offer students the choice to go to lunch with one of our students. We stopped doing that in the fall, and now we only do that for our admitted students that are coming to campus. But if they request it, I think we're still happy to provide that service, but not many folks are asking for it now.
All right, so here's a few others I'll ask you. I'd like to sit in a class. So what is that? You feel that's a fair request, or is that kind of a little bit over the top? We can't be accommodating all this, like coming to an open house or something like that if you want something fuller. Like, what are your thoughts on that request?
Well, Mark, pre-COVID, we used to do that every single day, Monday through Friday. Students could come, well, because we're on the block system, so we only have class from 9 to noon, and so a student could do that. Now, though, not an option. And I think if students are requesting that, we usually advise them, apply. If you end up getting in, we will have those options for you later on in the spring, so that we kind of ease their worry, because we know it's a big decision is what the classroom environment is like. So we try to ease those worries with, if you get in, we will have that option available for you later on, but no, not in the fall.
What about, I'd like to kind of chat with an admission officer one-on-one beyond just the info session.
Absolutely. We love that. Yes. Yeah. And sometimes it may not be your direct admission rep who reads your application, but we have what's called a director of the day and a backup director of the day who sort of leads the session and is just around. So that is absolutely an option for families.
And do you recommend that a student attempt to reach their regional admission officer, their territory manager? Should they start there, or should they start with just the coordinator as a starting place if they are interested in meeting an admission officer? Like, what should the process be for the student, or to set that up?
I've had students do it both ways. Some students, especially that are interested in like early decision, I've had them email me, a week or two before they're actually scheduled to attend, saying, will you be on campus? I'd love to chat with you and just get to know you. And if I'm on campus, perfect. The students that are a little less excited, or maybe we're a little bit further down on their list, they're less likely to do that, I think, overall. And that's fine. Go to the information session, get to know the person that's presenting, because they are going to be just as knowledgeable as someone like myself or, another recruiter on the team. So I don't think that there's a preference either way. Usually I tell students, go to the information session, get the knowledge that you need. If you still have specific questions afterwards, I'm happy to have that one-on-one conversation with you. But also the counselor who's in charge that day is also equipped to answer those questions as well.
What about the person that's really got a passion area and there's some sort of facility linked to their passion area, and they want to know, I'd love to be able to see X, and it's not something that's traditionally on the tour? Is that a fair request or not?
Yes. Yeah. So we actually had a student last week who has a particular interest in the arts. And so we acquired the Fine Arts Center a couple of years ago in our community. And so our ambassador, after the tour was done, took her over to the Fine Arts Center. So I think it's really kind of the luck of the draw, right? Like the ambassador had time after her tour to show the student the FAC. The FAC was open, Fine Arts Center. Sometimes though, like maybe a professor is doing an afternoon lab, and so you can't get into that facility, or there's no one available to take you there. One thing though is we will always direct you to where you need to go, right? And so if you're wanting to see the brain lab on campus, we will send you to the science department to see if it's an option for you to go in there. So it's not like we're always, no, you can't do that. Sorry, try again next year. We're always willing to say, might as well go and ask, right? And so in directing them to where they need to go.
And I'll just throw several out at once because it may be the same answer for all of them. I'm not sure. So someone's really interested in like the career center. Someone else is really interested in academic supports or academic success center. Someone else is interested in like learning differences, disability services. Does the same answer apply to all of that? Or is it sort of like, are those legitimate if someone wants to have some customized component of their visit that involves meeting with somebody there? What should be their process?
Yes to all three of those. I think because of our smaller campus environment, we do have the privilege of having the walk-in hours. And so families can absolutely go to the advising hub to ask questions about academic life, or go to accessibility services and ask about, our resources on campus, or our health and wellness center, our career center. So I think by far, most of the departments on campus are happy and willing to host families for a 30-minute session. And that's not something that they have to sign up for in advance. They can just show up and just chat with somebody, which is really nice.
How much time would you say to a family that says, I want to come visit you? How much time should I block off?
For like a daily visit?
Yes, daily visit. Depends which type, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, if they're just coming for like an information session and campus tour, I would say like 3 hours is probably a sufficient amount of time. And that even leaves some wiggle room to ask questions and, meander around campus. But then I would say, 5 to 6 if you're looking for a more fuller day.
Friends, this concludes the third part of a 5-part series I'm doing with Marissa Salizar, who's over all the visits at Colorado College. We hope you'll join us next week for part 4 or 5. Friends, on Monday's episode, we're going to have another SpeakPipe question because we've got about 10 in the kitty, and we don't like to be that far behind. So Julie and I will be discussing video submissions, advice about what to know when it comes to submitting a video in your college application. And we'll have a brand new interview that Linda had with Soup Campbell, and anybody that goes by the name Soup, is cool. Soup's a former director of admission. Now he's over marketing for Zemi. We've had Zemi on before, but Zemi's doing some brand new things. And Linda and Soup will be talking about how Zemi can really help a student to understand the colleges they're either applying to or they've been admitted to. You are not going to want to miss this 4-part interview. And friends, I've been having these admissions quotes on the personal statement. And I've specifically chosen the personal statement because it's the one thing that really late in the game you can do to have some impact on your application. You really can't do that with things like activities or recommendations, and certainly not your transcript or your testing. So this comes from a former admission counselor officer at Stanford named Grace Kim. And she simply says this: we always said when I was an admission officer, we want it to be so personal to the student that you couldn't put anyone else's name on that essay. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.